Welcome back. If you're just joining us, this is Africa 360. Our focus today is the Millennium Development Goals and Africa's chances of achieving them by the year 2015, which is the deadline that has been set globally. Now, joining me to take the discussion further is Mr. Jay Naidoo from the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, and Fatima Shabdouan, who is the Country Director for Action Aid South Africa. Thank you so much for joining us on Africa 360. So, the Millennium Development Goals, it is this set of goals that have been globally agreed upon, which envisage a state of affairs that should have been arrived at by 2015. The question to you, Mr. Naidoo, isn't this too broad and too general to really result in any effective delivery?
Well, let's look at the positives and the negatives. The first thing is it's important in 2000 that the world's leadership stood up and said, these are goals that we should achieve as the world. Yeah. Because they relate to global development. Mm-hmm. But really underpinning that was that each country should have gone back and developed its plans for achieving each of the MDGs. Yep. And that's where the greatest shortcoming has been. And I think we haven't had that commitment from many countries. Where there has been progress, it's been mainly the fact that governments have got together with civil society, have got together with business, with academia and scientists, and worked out plans that bring resources, financial resources, expertise, new models of working to tackle those very specific goals. This is
a fantastic point that you're raising, and let's bring Fatima into the conversation here, because on the one hand, yes, it's very good and well globally to get these commitments. But the question that I have to you is specifically when we look at Africa, what has been the challenge in establishing these national development frameworks at a national level that meant that we should now have this global matrix for development, which, as far as I'm concerned, hasn't really worked?
Well, I do think to start off, it is important that for the first time in history, developmentally, we've had this agreed global set of goals across North and South, between government, civil society, and the donors, which have helped us to galvanize our attention on very specific fault lines in the world. It's the places where poverty manifests. So I do think we shouldn't dismiss this as an achievement. But the reality is that if you throw enough resources at problems like nutrition, like education, it's possible to reduce it for a short period of time without fundamentally addressing the structural causes which gave rise to these problems in the first place. And these are our concerns at this stage.
It's a great point, and there's a specific term that you used, which is invest. That the world needed to invest at a specific time in addressing these global challenges. But Jay Naidoo, here's the thing. You know, you've been involved in investments and stuff like that. They talk about a return on investment. What is the return on investment globally for the developed world to try and invest in continents like Africa, which suffer in certain instances from chronic underdevelopment?
Well, you know, let's look at investment in a global term. For example, at a country level, we know that the most important thing in a child's life is to pay attention to that child's mother when she's pregnant, make sure that she has the proper nutrients and nutrition, make sure there's antenatal facilities available to her, make sure for the first 6 months of a child's life that that child is exclusively breastfed, make sure that there's proper delivery of water and sanitation. And if you look at that 1,000 days, if you take nutrition and the causes that drive child mortality and maternal mortality, we know the first 1,000 days of a child's life is in fact that window of opportunity. If you do not address it there, it comes back in higher healthcare costs, because undernutrition the first 1,000 days is linked to diabetes, which is an epidemic in our country and across Africa, hypertension, bone diseases, and cardiovascular diseases.
But here's the thing. Jay Naidoo knows these things. Why do we need the Millennium Development Goals to define these and the return on investment developmentally?
Yeah, but I think
for us to achieve
the issue of investment, what is the most important investment, Chris? You know, for us in the developing world, our government is the elephant in the room. If our governments do not work, then the public systems collapse, and where the poor are, they use the public systems. They don't have the money to go to private health care or to private schools. So the problem of tackling the development in the developing world is sure to have the support of donors, but we have to address the structural issues that cause poverty, that make our public services fail. And that's where I don't think in the MDG scenario we've brought the real elephant in our room, our governments, to be more accountable.
Fatima, then, this is the thing, ma'am. He's talking about political will. It would have been apparent, almost obvious, for me to assume that all African government must develop a political will towards achieving these goals, irrespective of the UN establishing this fantastic framework.
Well, if you talk to African governments, I'm sure that they, without a doubt, would say that they do have the political will, but we do see a significant disconnect between the political speeches of government and the actions on the ground. And here I think the question that Jay raises is the extent to which governments are willing and able to be accountable to their people, and there is a massive deficit on our continent.
And why is that then? Why wouldn't governments want to be accountable to the very same people that they claim to represent and that they would govern?
Well, I think we should go to the heart of the problem of development, and that's about governance. Africa is the richest continent in the world in terms of our mineral wealth. In terms of the demographics of our population, half our population is under 19, whereas the populations of most continents are aging. If you look at the land and water available, we have 2/3 of the arable land in the world. Yet the question is, we do not value our assets. So our most important assets that can deliver development, can develop jobs, deliver the infrastructure we need, is here with us. So we have to go back to the issue of governance and ask ourselves the question, why are people poor when we live on the richest continent?
Governance at the center of discussing development in Africa, and certainly will we be able to achieve these lofty Millennium Development Goals? Do stay with us on Africa 360 as we continue our discussions on development and so much more. Those are indeed the issues, and they are being addressed by some of the African leaders. I must admit that in my conversation with President Jacob Zuma, I was struck by the succinct nature in which he began to define some of the challenges facing Africa. But some of them, Fatima, come from outside of the continent's control. For example, he indicates the fact, that is President Jacob Zuma, the fact that one of the challenges in achieving these Millennium Development Goals is the fact that some of the commitments that were made or promised by globally developed partners have not been met. They cite the fact that we are currently in the midst of a global economic downturn. Is that a fair excuse for them for not meeting their, commitments?
Well, Chris, the short answer is no, but there are two considerations. The one is that we shouldn't look at the global economic crisis as a distinct conversation from the MDGs, and it's the point that I made earlier. Part of what we need to do is critically look at the global economic framework and how these have contributed to the crises that we find ourselves in globally, but also on the African continent. So it's not a separate conversation. The second part of the conversation is that the G8 and all the developed countries were behind with their investment commitments before the economic crisis hit. So there is also a discussion around the political commitment of the North to its developmental investments in the South. We haven't seen them come to the table and meet their obligations, and the global economic crisis of 2008 has become the excuse for not meeting these targets.
Some fantastic points that you raised there, but President Zuma takes it further, and then he points his criticism directly at Africa. And he says what African countries need to be doing is making those borders softer, enhancing regional integration, making sure that there's enhanced intra-Africa trade, but more importantly, developing infrastructure that can support the kind of growth and development that we're looking forward to. Are these sound advices that we're getting from South Africa's president?
Well, infrastructure is, of course, a developmental key to eradicating poverty, but we also know that it's possible to have very developed infrastructure as we have in South Africa, and for that to be cold comfort to people who can't access that infrastructure. It doesn't matter to poor people in South Africa that they live in the country with the highest development of roads, telephone, water, electricity, if they themselves are sitting in informal settlements where they can't access water or electricity. So the issue about access and also inequity, which doesn't feature in the MDGs at all, is a key further point of the discussion.
And this is a fantastic point to bring in Mr. Global Equality and indeed Mr. South Africa Equality. You heard the president, and Fatima also indicates that we need to emphasize, especially in countries with unequal growth, when you look at South Africa's Gini coefficient and indeed a lot in the rest of Africa, what we note is deep inequality.
There is deep inequality, but let me go back to what President Zuma said. In 2007, when he was elected the ANC president, I was asked as the chair of the Development Bank of Southern Africa to chair a health and education roadmap, particularly in health, to solve the lunacy of our AIDS denialism, which made us the epicenter of HIV and AIDS in the world, and that killed hundreds of thousands of our people. And what we did is we brought into the room the scientists, the private sector, civil society, the government, the unions, and we worked out a plan. When the minister came into the new administration, Barbara Hogan when she started, and then our current minister, Dr. Arun Matsuledi, they had a plan. They hit the road running. The reason why we have achieved our goal, an MDG goal in HIV/AIDS, is because of that. That is why we've achieved our goal on child mortality, because we addressed the issue of mother-to-child transmission. This is not rocket science. We do not need a donor to help us. We have a 1 trillion rand budget. The biggest issue is to get that money to do what it's supposed to do. So what we have to do is bring governance into our speech. We can develop a plan in an inclusive way. The problem in Africa is that civil society has very little space to talk to governments, to work together like we have done in South Africa and where we are still having our challenges. And I think that's the issue. At the end of the day, the people always know better at the local level what works and what doesn't work.
As we arrive, I think, at this logical conclusion to our conversation, Fatima, I think it's important that we discuss in some detail what then the post-2015 consensus should be for Africa in particular. What should we be looking at? What are the lessons learned?
Well, Chris, I think the first thing is I don't think we should move seamlessly from MDGs to post-2015 as the UN is pushing us to do now. We have to pause and have a conversation with people who live in poverty and ask them what should be at the center of these solutions. I do want to agree with Jay. The point is that when you speak to people who live in poverty, they usually have a fairly good idea of what is needed to turn their livelihoods around. And part of the critique of the MDGs was that not enough of that had happened, that there was too much focus on the macro level strategies by governments. So I do think we must use the transitions from MDGs to post-2015 to go back to talk to people and let them be at the center of crafting the agenda going forward.
This is a fantastic point to end our conversation. All that's left for me to do is really thank you guys for your fantastic insights. We've really learned so much about how important it is to include people, irrespective of their class, education, because sometimes their best ideas come from them. That does certainly bring us to the end of this debate. And